mic, but I don't want to take too much time. So, well, let's pick up from here. Hopefully, it doesn't get too problematic. Going through, the tech interchange. Our last meeting was June 20. We skipped one for the July 4th holiday here in the U.S. As far as what we missed, we will be able to catch everybody up on anything of note. This is a good chance then, I think, for anyone who hasn't done the tech interchange before or is fairly new to OpenWhisk in general to introduce themselves. And of course, James Tom looks like he's wearing a beautiful pirate hat. So it's, I guess nobody new then that we'll introduce. Crap.
You can try the dial-in, Brendan. I'm pasting the number to your Slack.
This is amazing.
So Brendan, do you want me to keep going? You want to try the dial-up, maybe? So I'll just proceed on and assume that Brendan's going to try an alternative mechanism. So are there any people who are new attendees that care to introduce themselves today? A lot of familiar faces. I think I see user IDs and people I know. I don't know if they've ever been on the call before. Feel free to introduce yourself. If not, we can move on quickly.
That's what I keep thinking.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Sorry, somebody wanted to introduce themselves? Or just an errant unmuted microphone. Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. Onto the main skeleton of the agenda. We usually cover main OpenWhisk topics. Anyone care to highlight any recent pull requests or discussions that are affecting main OpenWhisk? I think that we have a presentation and discussion being led by Marcus, if I'm correct. So I don't know how much time you want to allot Brendan to that topic. I think it's worth a good amount. So Marcus, are you prepared to take over and start presenting?
Sure. I don't have any slides though. I just go through the CWiki thingy because really I want to have a lot of discussion on the dev list at best. But let me quickly. Actually, can you hear me? Brilliant. Okay. Where's the share button? Forgot where it is. Oh god, this is embarrassing.
It might be floating at the top or at the very bottom.
It's the green one. I got it. I got it. Here you go. Can you see my screen, I suppose?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so I put out this fairly big architecture proposal onto the dev list because let me talk about my motivation a little bit first. The main motivation is that I think we as a community need a common goal to shoot for. And I feel like today we don't have that common big goal where we all are in agreement of where we are going. We have little, I might not say little, but we have proposals left and right, and they actually plug into this holistic architecture view in some pieces. But I think we as a community should have, so to say, a roadmap to what are we planning to achieve, not necessarily in a given time frame, but where do we want to get with this. For once, this gives us a common direction, and second, it also gives us a filter so we can say if different proposals come up and we don't like them, or we as a community decide that we don't want to take them, we can at least point out that this is not in alignment with our roadmap. So yeah, that's one wrinkle to see it. The main motivation is that I think there are basic architectural differences from the way people are using and deploying OpenWhisk today. For one, there's the way where OpenWhisk is deployed on raw VMs or bare metal machines or whatnot, where you have that notion of a controller which puts stuff on Kafka and then that gets to an invoker, and then the invoker only manages a small amount of containers on the host that the invoker is running on. And second, there's the way where OpenWhisk is deployed in a container orchestrator, where basically you have the same components, but it feels kind of foreign to have to put an invoker on the node where the pods are running, since you're creating the pods through the Kubernetes or Mesos API, and they are put wherever. So you don't have that notion of locality of the invoker to the containers. So it feels kind of foreign, and there has been work, for example, Tyson Norris's clustered singleton invoker work, where actually they try to put a single invoker in the middle of the architecture chart, and then have that have that manage all the containers underneath. That puts certain, well, that surfaces certain problems. For instance, in this case, you need a very fast invoker, where in the other case, people don't really care about the quickness of the invoker. And I think out of this architectural differences arises a little bit of friction in the community and a little bit of, yeah, an unnecessary, we are unnecessarily unaligned, so to say. So I throw together this, this proposal of an architecture, and this is totally not only my thoughts. This is absolutely grown out of different discussions. It's grown out of experience. I don't claim this to be based on my own thoughts entirely. So to get, and the goal of the proposal is to align all of this, to give us a future perspective, to pull all of the different proposals that we have out there on a common ground, and draw a picture of where we could go together. So the proposal itself, it wraps itself around the idea that, let me see, search it, that the critical path should be really quick, for one, and second, that the containers should be abstracted in a way that they are just an IP and a port, essentially, so that the notion of the invoker becomes entirely unnecessary in this picture. And the idea is that taking the controller as we know it today, it should talk to the user containers directly, in the sense that it runs HTTP the /run or /init route to the user container, gets the response back. It then writes activation records and whatnot. So a little bit of the responsibility that once was the invoker moves into the controller, and the second bit of that responsibility moves into what I called container manager in this picture. And mind you, this picture is a logical chart to a certain extent. The container manager could be part of the controller's implementation. It's not necessarily its own microservice, although I would think it is, but that's undecided. And take everything that I say with a grain of salt. This is the proposal is not entirely fleshed out, and it isn't supposed to be. I'd like to be as much discussion around the edge cases of it as we could get, so we get as many thoughts into this as we can, to have a common understanding of where we want to go, and that we achieve all of this together. So as I said, invocation path, the warm invocation path is request comes into the controller schedules or picks a user container, runs HTTP, gets the response, writes activation record and whatnot, and gives the response back. That's the warm path, the good case, so to say. If the controller doesn't have a free container, it requests such a container from the container manager. And now the container manager is just an interface, and this is where unification between Kube, Mesos, and a bare metal use case comes into play. It is an interface to whatever places and creates containers on whatever node they might think of. So the controller just knows, I need a container, a Node.js container with this action running, give it to me. And then the container manager can go ahead and ask either the Mesos API or Kubernetes API or in the future to be implemented container manager agent cluster, I'll talk about that in a second, to create such a container. Whatever does that now creates a container. Let's say, for example, we use Kube API. So a pod gets created somewhere, and the container manager gets back just the IP and port of that pod, and maybe the pod name to be able to manage it. It then goes ahead and updates the lists of containers in all controllers. And that means that the controller only ever handles warm cases. It doesn't know about pre-warming. It doesn't know about cold starts. It only knows warm invocations, or I don't have resources for this, give it to me. That's all the controller knows in this case. That also means that all invocations going directly down are warm all the time. Have I forgotten something? Yeah, so that bit of it resembles the clustered singleton invoker proposal that Tyson once put out. And talking directly into the user containers, I think, is a concept that has come up a lot in discussions on Slack, and even in a proposal put out by Dominic, who has the proposal on autonomous container scheduling. This puts another perspective on it, but in essence, talking directly to user containers is taken from there, basically. Kafka or any other queuing mechanism, whatever that might be, is still in the picture in the sense of an overflowing workload queue, where we say, if the controllers cannot find a warm container, and if the container manager says, I cannot create new containers, please go away. All of this load will be put onto a Kafka queue to be rescheduled later at a later point if resources are available again. Any questions so far?
So just to confirm, the controller would be getting it would also call init, or init would be done by the container manager itself, so it would only has to do run?
That's a good question. I think we could make that's undecided, but I think we can make the container manager call init as well.
Okay. Basically, it boils down to is the container manager only managing a homogeneous set of like per kind of images, or it is managing a lot more heterogeneous kind of fine-grained leaf level containers where the actual the function is also loaded. But
if we get into the load balancing bit, you'll see that it needs to know about the actions of each container.
Okay.
It needs to know that for a different bit. Okay, so let's go into load balancing. Today, our load balancing serves two purposes, so to say. First, it affects where in your cluster the container is put, which also means where in the cluster the resources are consumed. And second, it affects if you use a warm, a pre-warm, or a cold container. This proposal breaks this out into two different responsibilities. The controller decides whether your next call will be a warm start, i.e. you directly go down to the container, or if it needs to ask for more resources, which will mean a cold start. The container manager now is entirely in charge of deciding where to place this user container. The controller doesn't care. Controller only ever knows IP port. Now the container manager can decide where to put stuff and or delegate that decision to Mesos or Kubernetes API. Does that make sense?
So you really have two things that always need to have full knowledge of what is actually currently running across all of the various nodes in the system, because the controller needs to know what's currently available. And the container manager, possibly by proxy through Mesos or Kubernetes, also needs to be aware of what's actually currently scheduled across all of the nodes. So there's really kind of a mirror of the pool of available resources in each one of those 2 plus n number of controller areas.
Roughly.
Okay.
Roughly. The important bit here is, and when it comes to load balancing, that's important. We have a very tight constraint on the allowed concurrency that we can put into each user container at any point in time. Today, this concurrency is set to 1. We only allow one action to run at a certain point in time in a certain container. We only can schedule another call if that action is finished. Tyson is breaking that up with his proposal on multi-concurrency, basically. But still, we will have a very tight constraint on the concurrency inside of a container. That also means that sharing state on this concurrency between the controllers, it's not feasible. Because under load and under bursts, that they will happen and change so quickly that shared state will be too much eventually consistent, so to say.
So each controller therefore only knows about the particular containers that it has requested from the container manager, not all of the containers available in the entire cluster.
Even a smaller wrinkle.
Okay.
That's roughly right, but I envisioned it to be that the container manager, say, it has a list of containers for action A and action B, at least a list for each. Let's say we have 4 containers of action A. It then goes ahead and distributes this list across all the controllers that are there distinctively. So each controller only knows a given subset of each action. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, so the container manager knows there's 2 controllers, so it hands 2 to controller A and 2 to controller B. So it's always keeping those pools distinct. So each controller, again, has just a pool of the resources to work.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that is especially that state that the controller has is very transient. If a controller leaves the cluster, the container manager will notice that, so they need to be clustered in some way that they notice that one of them is going down. If a controller leaves, the container manager will just redistribute the list that it had before.
If I recall correctly, there is an Akka clustering backend for controller currently. Yes.
Yes.
So, I mean, that's something to consider there as well. Certainly isn't optional, but we have at least a technology that we can use to do the clustering. It's just a matter of Akka persistence, I guess, to store the current state of the containers that a given controller knows about. No?
Absolutely.
We were interested in messing around with that in the Mesos side of the house for running multiple invokers, but we were a little worried about what the sync time of that would be across the entire cluster. Do you, just for my own academic knowledge, do you know how quickly that will come will be consistent across, like, let's say 5 or 6 nodes? Like, is it really, really fast, or is it something you kind of have to wait for?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I mean, it depends on how you're trying to use it. Typically with something like that, I would have it probably using something like sharding rather than sharing the state to every single node. And then the sharding manager would rebalance. So if a node went offline, it would make sure, at least when you requested given entities, that they would load back into memory on one of the nodes.
Okay.
Everything's broken down into chunks and then distributed based on the number of nodes available. Okay.
All right, cool. Yeah, we might hit you up for some advice on that if we go in that direction. Thanks.
Anytime, let me know.
The very important bit here is that you should only use state sharing of that sense on data that's not changing very quickly. What would be very quick changes would, for instance, be a concurrency on a given user container. I don't think that's shareable because it's, as you say, it's slow. But on the other hand, given we have a kind of stable controller cluster, distributing containers as they come up across this cluster, I think is a feasible approach. You know, under load, creating containers will happen a lot less often than any given request. That makes sense?
Is the container manager a single point of failure here, or is there going to be a cluster model or something similar for that?
Well, it's hard to cluster that bit because, you know, then there needs to be synchronization between the different container managers on what they do. I think this boils down to how big we can scale and how much work it really needs to do in the end. And then we need to decide whether we need a hot standby kind of thing on it, or if we need to be able to horizontally scale it.
Yeah, I was thinking even like a primary secondary model, because then you even have the option for things that only need to read the current state of being able to direct their reads to your secondaries and not putting load on the right node.
Yeah, it makes sense. As I said, it's not thought out until the very end. It's supposed to contain some pieces for discussion. So yeah, that's the basic idea on distributing the containers. It's done in a way so that each controller can, once the controller is up and it's connected to the cluster and it got its list of containers, it can manage whatever it does locally. So that means very consistent state, and that means a very high consistency on the concurrency limits that we have for each user container, which is what we need, I think. Yeah, we talked about scalability. I mainly in the same vein. I put out one edge case, and there was a little bit of discussion on this edge case. You have an edge case if you have multiple controllers in the system, because you might have, let's say, 1,000 users. But let's say one of these users is only ever needing one container and has very slow load. If you have X controllers and you assume that load balancing between these controllers is done via round robin or least connected or something else that essentially boils down to random, that means we would create one container per controller because they don't know of each other. And controller B in this case would think, oh, I don't have resources for this, give me something. The edge case here is, as long as you have less containers than you have controllers, what I envision this to be is that the container manager tells controller B to proxy its request to controller A, which will then run the workload and give it back. There's a penalty here to pay on latency, but then I think a workload that's so, well, in such a small dimension might be able to pay that small amount of latency, which is of course to be measured. I have no idea how much it is. Might be 2 or 3 milliseconds, might be more, might be less. I don't know. That's guesswork.
Marcus, so just on this part, so the earlier model had this goodness of the stickiness in terms of same container receiving or same invoker receiving calls for the same action. Now, in this mode where each controller has, let's say, action A1, like for action A1, we have 3 controllers and each controller has 1 container assigned to it. Now, if the request comes in a round robin fashion, but if that was also related to my mail on the DL, like if the round robin happens on arbitrary request or it's also applied at the individual action level, then it's fine. Like each container would get requests for the actions. But if the round robin happens for the whole set, then it might happen like all the requests for one action might be hitting always few of the controllers rather than homogeneously distributed. In that case, they would be accumulating more load compared to others. So they would be going through the overflow scenario rather quickly compared to the current case.
I think that's true. Yes, I think that's true. Yeah, it might make sense. It might make sense to have a deeper investigation into what Nginx and friends offers here.
Yeah, because the critical part of the earlier design was this sharding based on hashing, and which efficiently uses the whole system. Now, as we move to this, we would need to have a similar kind of requirement from the load balancer, which is now in Nginx side on how it distributes or schedules the request to the request. Just from my understanding, how much is the overhead this Kafka thing adds to the overall thing? Like, and if you have any numbers in that.
Yeah, I think it's fairly low. It's 1 to 2 milliseconds each way.
Okay.
So it's not a huge deal. What it does though is it at least in the model that we have today, it prevents streaming of parameters and input values and output values.
So primarily, it's more impacting the web actions rather than the non-web actions.
No. Not necessarily. It impacts everything that takes parameters and returns a result. Because all of this is written onto the Kafka thing itself. which means it's held in memory at some point.
Okay.
Okay. Next bit is on throttling and limits. Well, essentially, the nice thing in this case is that we can apply today we have a concurrency limit, and that concurrency limit essentially says you only are allowed to have so many requests in the system at any given time. In this case, we can actually, I think we can much closer reflect what we actually want to throttle in this case, and that is resource consumption. What we want to do is we want to prevent a user from allocating infinite amount of containers. And so in the same vein as the container manager takes the grunt load of load balancing in terms of placement, the container manager also can also limit the amount of containers that are created for each given namespace or each given subject or each given action, really, which is another requirement for a common requirement from users to be able to limit the concurrency of each action in the system. So we can apply this limit at the container manager level on container creation. The per minute throttles that we have today, I think they feel kind of foreign, and they are weirdly implemented, as in they really flip to 0 when the minute flips. That's kind of not what you usually implement in terms of a burst throttle. So it might make sense to move this throttle to, I don't know, to Nginx or something different, or even drop it entirely. Then again, this section isn't really fleshed out. Neither is the logging section. I think there is some precedent work on even extracting logs from the log files written by a Kubernetes pod using what they've built for the Kubernetes Container Factory. I think it was called Invoker Agent. There's work there, but I think in general there has been some discussions on how we want to attack logging in the future. And I think that having log extraction on the critical path as we have today is not viable from a performance point of view. So we might want to take this discussion further, especially once Tyson's proposal with multi-concurrency per container hits the ground. That will be obsolete anyway, because then we need to cut. You just don't know which activation is responsible for which log line.
I do recommend here, Marcus, looking at the Akka model for how we handle logs internally. One of the big things there, it's, one of the big performance hits I used to always run into was people who'd implemented their own logging that, directly writes to log files, because then you've got a lock within the actor. So the Akka model is using pub/sub internally, that any logging statements are being dropped onto pub/sub and then picked up by an actor that's managing the logs, unless that's changed since last time I looked at it. So it's very much that asynchronous approach. Everything gets onto the pub/sub bus, but you're not thrashing trying to write logs out. So there's a model there that works. It's similar to what you're describing, I guess, is more what I'm aiming at.
Yeah, the big discussion is around how to get the context that you need into each and every log line. Because today it would be up to the user to include the activation ID in per logs. And that's the issue that we have today. That's why we have to thread everything back through the invoker today to essentially enrich the logs with that context. So that's the issue. But I think that's something we can figure out I think this is something we need to figure out more generally. It's not essentially tied to this proposal here.
Yeah, we've kind of already done some of that, but we can cheat a little bit internally because we have a lot more control over the action containers that are deployed on our system. So yeah, we've already kind of ripped that off and sent all the logging to Splunk. So it all happens out of band from the container and from OpenWhisk's perspective.
Yeah, we have log drivers like the log store log driver, where you can just the log driver log store where you can use whatever log store the log driver, Docker or Kubernetes or whatever provides it with. We have that notion, yes, but I think you know, we need to come to an implementation that works for the open source case as well. That's where kind of where I'm heading here. Yeah, container lifecycle.
Oh, Marcus, I guess another consequence from your proposal regarding logs is, I mean, today we have a kind of guarantee that we capture logs for each activation and that we even drop a warm container if logs cannot be extracted properly. So in future, I guess we don't have a deliver guarantee for each and every log line anymore. And we won't destroy the container if log extraction fails, right?
I don't know about the guarantee, but there won't be consistency with the activation record and your logs, yes.
And we have no more direct notion because log extraction or log forwarding is no more on the critical activation path. If log extracting fails at some point in time, we won't necessarily clean up the container, but just continue. Only if the situation gets too worse, we are dropping the container at some point in time.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, so the container lifecycle is a little bit of a harder bit to do because on Kubernetes and or Mesos, I actually don't know for Mesos, but on Kubernetes, pods don't support the pause or unpause operation, at least not today. It's not part of the interface. So what Dave did in his implementation is he deploys an invoker agent, and in this case it's called container manager agent, but that's interchangeable in that notion. I just didn't want to have the word invoker in here. It deploys that as a daemon set on each worker node where pods will be created, where user pods will be created, and those are then able to directly reach to the underlying Docker daemon or container D daemon or whatnot to pause and unpause these containers. And that would, of course, need to be on the same on the path that actually controls the HTTP request to the user container, which will be the controller. That means if a user container is unused for X milliseconds by the controller, it needs to send a pause event to the container manager. So the user container is paused. And if it wants to reuse it again, it needs to send an unpause. That's at least the idea in this case. The thing is, we have that pause grace today, like we wait for, I think, 50 milliseconds by default, and that's configurable until we pause a container. So under a quick burst, that operation will not be done anyway. So that path should be really quick. Creating and deleting containers, as I said, is part of the container manager, and deleting is especially delicate. I envisioned it to kind of as in a way that the container manager goes to the controller and says, look, I want to remove this container, give it back to me. Now the controller responds to that once it completed all the HTTP requests it wants to complete on that container, and then says, here you go. I deleted it from my state. So now it's safe to remove that from the container manager. So this is a little bit of a case where we need to be wary of any timing issues. Yeah, so that's been quite a long monologue. I encourage everybody to read through it and to point out any obvious mistakes that I made. In general, does anybody think this cannot fly, or is anybody of the opinion that we should do something completely different? Then please write that to the dev list as well. Don't hesitate to take this completely apart if you feel that's necessary.
Marcus. Hello.
Thanks. This is great.
Yep. Hello.
And what kind of Kafka topics do you expect? Since container manager, container creation is not sequential now, and so we can use only one overflow topic, And do we need to manually manage multiple topics for each actions, or just like Dominic proposed, or what kind of topic do you expect?
Yeah, I'd kind of like to get around an unbounded number of topics. I think that's been pointed out on Dominic's proposal a lot. The concern, at least, that the amount of topics is unbounded. So yeah, in theory, you could use a single overflow topic, which would also mean that every request that gets into overflow will be handled sequentially. But since the current implementation of the overflow topic is still in the works, I guess we can figure out there what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
One option that I have been thinking is to use the action name as the partition key, and then have a way where the consumers which are pulling from the overflow topic may seek ahead and pick up for the have container pools per action at some level finally, and have then these container pools itself pick up their activations by filtering aggressively from the Kafka topic. It's a bit hazy right now. I need to pen it down, but would share on the DL on rough sketch. The goodness I like of the Dominic's proposal was this goodness of consistent throughput we can achieve. Let's say if we are using it for a steady kind of system, it gives a much better throughput guarantees. Having one topic per action is, yes, extreme. So having a middle ground somewhere would be helpful.
Brandon just sent a message that we need to have more topics on this call. So let's.
Yeah, I had at least, I know there's at least one other discussion that Matt mentioned that I want to make sure we at least have a little room to cover.
So that's fine.
This is great though. I'm going to go through it further, but definitely it shouldn't be okay, we've discussed this, we're done, but continuing on the dev list. Certainly as much time as Marcus has spent on this. I did have one question before I jumped on to the next topic, which was whether anyone could give us an update on where we are on the release process, because I know that 090 incubating is in flight or close to ready, but. Anyone? I think the last that I saw was that it went up to the incubator PMC for approval. Yes.
Matt, are you there? Matt should be able to give an update. I think
the question is on the release.
Yeah, just where we stand. Anything we should know.
So Vincent's not here. He's been our intrepid release manager. And I will point out this whole release process started out on about June 16th. And Brendan, you might want to mute while typing. Thanks. So he had a baby boy last week. So he's out for a month. So don't expect to hear from him. He is trying to wrap up via email as time allows, and he's not babysitting to do whatever official announcements need to happen. He gave me some sporadic stuff on Slack yesterday, and I advised him to make sure our mentors are okay with making the announcement on the private list. I've not seen that request go to private, but it should happen. The official formal announce should happen soon. Do you want to keep going? I will mention for future releases, we need to pick a new release manager and test the system, test our documentation. Looking for volunteers for the next one whenever we want to schedule it. We're also looking, Vincent wants to look at when he comes back, doing what people had asked on some of the dev lists, which is how do we break apart some of the things to allow us to do releases of different components. Functionally, we can do that. We can actually change the tooling and change the automation to do that. But we have a larger problem is that we have dependencies between the components. We have unpublished versions, signatures, whatever you want to call them, between the different components. And we have to make sure that, it's my goal, is to make sure that when we produce a release, we release all the repos that have such dependencies next. We kind of held back this release because of fear of Apache Incubator being shocked at the number of repos. We're putting a zip file, but I think what we'll do is we'll do a middle ground approach. We'll put all the zip files for all the dependent repos into a single zip file. So apparently it'll look like one zip file to them and with one hash and everything, hopefully, and they won't get upset, but we'll explore that and discuss it in the dev list roundabout when Vincent comes back in a few weeks. Should I go on to the next topic, Brendan?
I think that makes sense. I assume that was the website redesign.
Yeah. So Pretty's on the call, and so I want to make sure that everyone gives her due credit for all of her work. So let me share my screen. So in earnest, no one's liked the website. No one's been maintaining the website. It's stale. It's doesn't feel right. It feels very, I have to say it, IBM-ish, with a lot of cartoonish figures and whatnot. So we wanted to crisp it up and bring it into the modern world, make it look like many popular sites, primarily Kubernetes is a goal. We want to build an affinity with Kubernetes, I believe. That's one of my goals. And accurately reflect our architecture and promote it as much on the front page. We have many goals. We're going to preserve Jekyll. Pretty spent a lot of our time trying to chisel away at the layout and the design and adjust the CSS, the dynamic CSS from Jekyll to simplify it, to make it more maintainable. We're trying right now. We're in the process of reading the homepage context. We're doing all the diagrams as scalable vector graphics, and we're making sure it scales to all sizes, to mobile phones, to tablets, and whatnot. Along with the simplification. Right now, we're finishing the documentation page, the community page. Our goal is to try and accumulate all information we have and present it quickly through a fewest number of clicks possible. We want to provide the documentation based upon, you can see a hint of it here. I don't have all of the stuff, but you'll come into the site, you'll basically select your role, and we'll take you to a set of documentation akin to your role, and even within those roles, we have subtypes you can select from. We're accumulating an index now. We're going to figure out how to present it. Then we've talked to James as well. We're going to probably talk to him about the repo we have called External Resources, formerly known as Awesome OpenWhisk, where people have been ad hoc adding to a markdown there. We intend to perhaps go through that list, see which items fall into like 3 categories: things that must be brought into the project and referenced from our website or documentation highly, things that are current and can be referenced for different feature areas, developer areas, and things that are basically we can't verify or have become stale. We'll probably figure out how to redo how we manage that set of information and maybe split out the markdowns with a goal towards automating the maintenance of those markdowns from the website, and then perhaps even using tooling in Jekyll to suck in those markdowns to present the list within the website. Again, Jekyll has many plugins. Is another reason we preserved it that we intend to leverage to bring in content. We don't want to reduplicate content. We want to use the markdowns there and in our repos, because that's where our developers, our contributors maintain it. It only highlight things, guide people, present them with enough information to know if they click a link, they're going to get the information they wanted for their role or for their needs. That's the overall goal of it all. We wanted to have a PR submitted today. We're not quite there. Once I clean up some of the menuing in the front page and Pretty completes the documentation page and I finish the community page, I think hopefully the next few days we'll see a PR against the website and open for comments and review there. And we'll announce it to the dev list, of course, and we'll just work to capture people's comments as issues and prioritize them accordingly and continue getting the website to a point where we're all proud of it and we believe it's on par with other like projects in our space. So any questions or comments?
Matt, this is pretty, I think just great work. This is kind of long overdue, and I think this is going to be great for the community. A question, I really like the idea that you can, as you've copied the thing where you can say, I'm a developer, I'm a whatever or whatever, and it will kind of tailor their content to you. Do you think it will be possible to have, when they go into, if they're a developer or a user, and it gives them, you know, the kind of intro stuff, whether we can have them choose a language and then have the examples in their language? Do you think that will?
Yes. Yeah. So basically, I'm treating this like a giant indexing effort initially, indexing all the blogs, all the helps for, like we mentioned Haskell, even the front page, the stuff that you've done in your blogs, Jen.
Yeah.
We want to be able to go down to that granularity. Eventually, you go to the developer, I want to do runtimes, I want to write functions, and we actually have listing. We want to have both a complete indexing and listing, as well as one that is organized by roles.
That sounds good. Because I mean, one of the complaints I get is for serverless is everything's in JavaScript, and people want examples in other languages. So to be able to say, like, I'm a Ruby person, then everything would be in Ruby. You know, just the basic hello world stuff would be a massive improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. That's our goal. Absolutely. It's developers first. So
I was doing something last year, and I think it was working with Azure, where, you know, they had a nice interface that, you know, you see the code examples, but are essentially tabs above the code example to pick the language in particular that you want. So it's sort of, okay, even if you accidentally ended up at the JavaScript page because you Googled it, you've got kind of an easy way to jump over to C# or whatever else without having to go back and start through the index again.
Yeah, we'd love to move to more robust presentation mechanisms, but right now we don't even have all the information indexed and organized. That's our top level goal, is to the organization and how we present it. We do want to include widgets somehow to like show the latest blog post to Medium, to show the latest whatever releases, pull requests. There's things in Jekyll we can leverage for that. I didn't see any immediate things for presentation of that, but we'd like to get those on the homepage. Now, basically, we want people to be able to only be 1 or 2 clicks away from the information they need. That's the goal.
I think Travis CI also has that type of documentation. I had one, so maybe we can check that out. I had one little comment. Of course, you've spent time on this and been thinking about this, so maybe my suggestion doesn't make any sense, but I was thinking maybe we could rename users to action creators, because I think people identify more with being an action creator as being a user. But you know, think about it, see if it makes sense.
Yeah, we try to think of names. The names are for subject for debate and discussion. We have identified roles, and when roles within a few roles within, we see more developers being the main role, and many people and users being a role, and sub roles underneath those. So this is Pretty's got a lot more. This is what she's checked in so far early. She's been working on that, I know, all day yesterday, but she's been pulled away on Whisk deploy issues. So she's been working hard there, and if she wants to give an update on that or add to what I've said, she's the expert on the content here.
So I do want, before we exit, to make sure that we have someone to moderate the next one. That will be August 1st, if there's anybody that wants to step up to volunteer. Anyone?
I'd be happy to. Sorry, I was just checking my calendar, but I'd be happy to moderate the next one.
Sorry, who is that speaking?
This is Justin Horsell.
Great. So I will. I'll write you down on that. I'll make sure that you have. I think Matt was the one who walked me through everything for this week. So at least make sure you have the info if you don't have it to put that together. And I'll write you down on that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Was there anything else in there, Matt, that you had? I know at one point there was a mention on an update of Whisk deploy, although it looks like we're short on time here.
Yeah, there was a couple things with deleting triggers along with feed actions. There was some logic where the feed action didn't delete, the trigger didn't delete, and I think Pretty's addressed that area. She's also changed retries to be longer. So if you've been having problems with Whisk deploy with feed actions and triggers, that might solve your problem.
All right, sounds good. Unless anybody has anything else, then I will call it. As a reminder, then it's same bat time, same bat channel on August 1st for our next episode. Otherwise, thank you everyone for attending, and I'll see you next time.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.